The other week, I saw a viral video where someone confidently says that they read a study that found husbands add an extra 7 hours of housework per week for women. Now, I don't have a husband, but a lot of people in my life do. And I've got to say, this stat is one of those that just like feels right. And the comment section of the video definitely reflected that. Here's the problem: just because something feels right does not mean it is legit, doesn't mean it's true. That's not how facts work. Naturally, I went looking for the study because I had to know, are husbands really creating more housework? In the olden days, sure, but like in this day and age, they're creating more housework. I had to know. I had to find out. Well, wouldn't you know it? A supporting study for this fact is nowhere to be found. In fact, all I could find with this 7 hours number was I don't even know what to call it, like a blog, a press release on the University of Michigan's website, where it had been hanging out since 2008. So let's dive in and talk about it. Where did this stat come from? Why is something so outdated suddenly trending in 2025? And most importantly, why does it matter that we get numbers like this right? Let's start with what we do know. The viral claim comes from this press release blog article thingy from the University of Michigan in 2008, and its title is Exactly How Much Housework Does a Husband Create? Clickbait was around even then, y'all. Even then, back in 2008. It never goes out of style. The lead sentence of the, we'll call it an article, says having a husband creates an extra 7 hours a week of housework for women, according to a University of Michigan study of a nationally representative sample of US families. It's on a university website. It references a study. I can understand why people are repeating this. I can understand a little less why we're repeating it like 20-ish years later, but still, like it seems credible. And truth be told, it might be. But wouldn't it be nice if there was some, I don't know, evidence to support it? In this article, they share the following. The findings are part of a detailed study of housework trends based on 2005 time diary data. That's like a detailed log where someone is like recording all of their like activities, how long they did it for, and like what time they did it for a 24-hour period. The data comes from the federally funded panel study of income dynamics, which has been conducted since 1968 at the University of Michigan Institute for Social Science Research. And researchers analyze data from the time diaries, which they explain are the most accurate way to assess how people spend their time. Personally, I'm a little skeptical just because I think I would be terrible at keeping a time diary. Like, I can't even keep like a food log. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, I have a hard time logging my migraines. It's just like too much work for me, additional work for me in the day. I'm a multitasker. This just seems like a productivity killing nightmare to me. It does make me wonder, like, what was the compensation for the study, and like, what did fidelity checks look like? Like, how did they determine if people are like doing the time diaries correctly and in real time and accurately and all of that fun stuff? But like, okay, they say it's the best way. That's what they said. They said what they said. They then supplemented the data from the time diaries with questionnaires that asked men and women to recall how much time they spent on basic housework in the average week. This included things like cooking, cleaning, and other basic work around the house. I'm not sure what they classified as basic work, but I can tell you what they did not include. This did not include gardening, home repairs, or washing the car. Just pointing it out, if we're going to stereotype, they are counting some housework as housework and some not as housework. And there are some traditional gender roles that may fall on either side of that division. Interesting to note. Most importantly for me, the use of the questionnaire just like begs the question, like if the time diary is like so great, why are we also making people do a questionnaire? This is a lot of work. I hope these people are compensated fairly. If you were part of this study back in 2005, please message me. I have so many questions. Please message me. Lastly, the article interviewed economist Dr. Frank Stafford, who directed the study. I don't want to say that there aren't a lot of details, because there are. Like, we generally know who was included in the study and how they collected the data. But there's a huge catch, and that is that I cannot find the actual specific study they're talking about anywhere. This press release article doesn't link to it. It's not in Frank Stafford's CV. It's not on his ResearchGate publication list. There are like related articles that he published around the same time, about calendar and time diary as like data sources, but like it's not in any peer reviewed journal anywhere. That doesn't necessarily mean that it never existed. It's possible that this was a preliminary analysis and it never made it to publication. Like, I don't know. Maybe this study really did, in fact, exist at some point. But the thing is to report a stat and be like, hey, I read this in a study. And then for the only source of information to be not a study, you couldn't have read it in a study. You read it on a university blog. Okay, let's be real. Even in the video, you show a screenshot of the university blog. You did not read the study. So that is misleading. And the study is nowhere to be found, which is for me concerning from the standpoint of like, okay, is this really true? Did this really happen? Did they really find this? How did they get the 7 hours? Like, I've got questions and there are not answers. Perhaps most troubling of all is that despite mentioning the 7 hours and like the kickoff to the article, right? There are no results presented or math that gets you to 7 hours. Like how does that work out? Let's do a little rundown of the numbers that are mentioned in the article, which means I'm willing to assume for the purpose of this podcast that this study does exist in some form somewhere. In 1976, women did an average of 26 hours of housework a week. Men did about 6 hours of housework a week. Now, contrast that with 2005, where the most recent data came from, and they found that women did about 17 hours of housework and men did about 13 hours of housework. So basically, according to this study, things are looking up for women. In 2005, women are doing less housework than they did 30 years before, and men are doing more. And then they look at just the past 10 years, which in this case, to remind you, is 1995 to 2005, so still 20 years ago, but at the time of writing, they looked at the most recent 10 years they had data on, and they found that men and women who got married both did more housework than if they were single. And direct quote from the article, marriage is no longer a man's path to less housework. Is this quote and this finding not in direct contrast to this whole major headline of like husbands creating more housework for wives? It's just interesting to think about these two things being presented simultaneously. Because on the one hand, you have like, hey, husbands are making 7 extra hours of housework. On the other hand, they're being like, you know what, if you get married, it doesn't actually help you do less housework. How can both those things be true? The world may never know unless we find this original data and study. The final group of stats mentioned, they talked about how single women in their 20s and 30s did the least housework, about 12 hours a week on average, while married women in their 60s and 70s did the most, about 21 hours of housework a week. Married women with more than 3 kids did an average of 28 hours of housework a week. Married men with more than 3 kids, by comparison, only did about 10 hours of housework a week. So if you are married with kids and a woman, you're doing a lot more housework than a man, according to this. But importantly, no matter how you math the math of all these numbers in that section, nowhere do you get, hey, when you get married, your husband's adding 7 hours of housework. None of the math works out that way. You don't even have a direct comparison of like all single women compared to like all married women in terms of hours of housework. You have a comparison of single women in their 20s and 30s to married women in their 60s and 70s, but like there is no way you can twist these numbers and get husbands are creating 7 extra hours of housework. It doesn't work. Exactly how much housework does a husband create? Title of the article, 7 hours according to the sentence that is reported nowhere else in the article. Question not answered by the article. If 7 hours is the actual difference between single and married women's hours of housework, well, single and married straight women's hours of housework, I would really be interested in knowing what they controlled for, like what they took into account when calculating that 7. Is it across all age groups? Was everyone childless? Did people have pets? What did their career path look like? Like stay-at-home wives or moms will like naturally spend more time on housework than women who work full time. If you're a single lady who works from home, you might also spend more time on housework because you're procrastinating like me during the day. If you have a dog, you might spend more time on housework. I vacuum so much more than I've ever in my entire life because I have a dog who sheds a lot. Like there are so many things that you would need to know in order to put this 7 hours into context. And like, I don't know that they controlled or considered or looked into any of those things because we don't have any of that information. So even if the 7 hours is true and it's like, okay, like single women did 7 hours less of housework than married women. It brings up this question of like, okay, based on the other factors, the other variables you included, is this really about marriage or is it about roles and lifestyle choices? It changes the entire conversation. Context matters. And if you're seeing a stat like this and the context isn't provided, these are the types of things you should be thinking about, the types of things that you should be asking. So clearly, I am not bought into this whole 7 hour thing. Like, frankly, I don't see any evidence to support it. And I think it's not only fair, but also like the right thing to do to question facts that don't have supporting evidence. There's a secondary interesting question here, which is why is this stat based on a 2008 article press release, which is based on 2005 data, suddenly blowing up 20 years later in 2025? I mean, honestly, like, I can't say for certain, but like, here are my hunches. It's super catchy. Social media platforms don't push accuracy, they push emotion. They amplify outrage, frustration, validation, because that's what keeps people scrolling and engaging. Ladies, your husbands are creating 7 extra hours of work for you. Lots of commentary about that. Lots of people who feel that's the same. Maybe you have people jumping in there to defend their husband and saying that's not the case for them. Like, it gets a conversation going. It's controversial. And things like this happen all the time. Like, let's be honest, that's why I have a podcast. And like, I'm going to be honest, the video I saw this in was super engaging. It was really well done. And honestly, that's just like even more frustrating because the fact that someone took the time to do like a well thought out video on research, talking about research, shows that like to some extent people care about research. People want to be able to share facts and stats and like quote unquote truths about the world, right? But there's a disconnect because they either don't have like the knowledge and the training to accurately fact check things, or they don't have like the time and interest in accurately fact checking things. So what they do is they end up oversimplifying, creating these sound bites and sharing things that go viral that are not based in reality. And that's the bigger problem because it's not just about one misleading stat, it's about the way that we consume and share research in general. Claims about gender roles and housework and invisible labor come up all the time. And oftentimes they are based on real trends. They just don't tell the whole story and they get amplified based on feelings. What's super interesting about this stat emphasizing the disparity between husbands and wives and housework is that we actually have more recent and more detailed data on this topic, but for some reason, that's not going viral. We're circulating this data from 2005. So let's take a minute and talk about what recent research actually says. The Bureau of Labor and Statistics does a super cool thing called the American Time Use Survey. We've actually talked about it on this podcast before. They've been collecting data since 2003 and are the nation's first federally administered continuous survey on time use in the US. So, how the survey works is it's conducted by the US Census Bureau, and its goal is to measure how people spend their time across different activities throughout their life. People are picked kind of like based on the census. Like they randomly select one individual aged 15 or older from households that have completed their 8th month of interviews for the current population survey. And then this person is interviewed via phone. And how the time diary works on the phone is that the interviewer begins by asking, at 4 a.m. yesterday, what were you doing? And then they continue to collect 24 hours of time use activity data. As you share like each activity that you reported, the interviewer records your response verbatim, so like exactly as you're saying it. And for most activities, they also collect information about where you were and who you were with when you were doing the activity. You're only asked about the day before. So this is an interesting like little piece to think about, right? Because context matters. So like if you are getting interviewed on like a Saturday or a Sunday versus a Wednesday, or like depending on what even like your work schedule, travel schedule looks like, your responses could be super different. Maybe you do have a child and they only go to school on like Monday, Wednesday, Fridays because they're little, and you get asked what you're doing on a Friday, so you're thinking about Thursday and your kids at home, that's going to show you doing a lot more childcare than if they were on a Friday when they were at school for half day, right? Like Context matters. Part of the interviewer's job is to make sure you're not thinking about the typical day. They want the previous day. And that's important. Like it's for accuracy, right? Like you can be more accurate about your past 24 hours and more specific than you can about like your average typical day. But it does just highlight the fact that like the day they're doing this thing on totally matters. So the most recent data we have right now from the American Time Use Survey is from 2003. Y'all, that was not that long ago. Y'all, if something should be going viral, it should definitely be the 2023 data, not the 2005 data. Like, come on, come on. In 2023, the American Time Use Survey found that women spend 2.32 hours per day on household activities compared to men's 1.49 hours. So women are spending more time on household activities. This includes things like food preparation and cleanup, interior cleaning, laundry, household management, lawn and garden care, interior and exterior maintenance and repair. So they're a little bit more inclusive of what they count as housework. And you'll note here that like this raw stat is not broken out by marital status. So it didn't compare single people to married people, but it could be because the census does have that data. It's just not how it's reported right now on the internet. But you could, were you so inclined, download the data set, cut the analysis by marital status, and find out the difference it makes in time spent on each of these activities with single women compared to women who are married. And if you wanted to do that, I would highly suggest that right now you pause this podcast and go download that data because government data is disappearing by the second from the internet. So if you're in the United States and you would like this data, get it right now. Let's say people like myself don't have time to dig into the raw data right now and figure out if and how much extra work husbands really create. Well, in October 2024, so not that long ago, the Gender Equity Policy Institute analyzed the American Time Use Survey data from 2022. Again, not that long ago, especially compared to 2005 data. And they found that simply being a woman is linked to spending more time on unpaid childcare and household work and having less free time, even when controlling for age, income, race, ethnicity, and marital status. Interesting, right? So that says, like, hey, if you are a woman, no matter how old you are, no matter how much money you make, no matter what race or ethnicity you have, and no matter whether you're married or not, you are going to spend more time on unpaid childcare and household work and have less free time. That is an interesting finding. It's not as punchy as like a husband's creating 7 extra hours of chores for you, but here are some viral worthy snippets from that report. Working women spend 2 times as many hours per week as working men on childcare and household work combined. Married women with children spend 2.4 times as much as their male counterparts on household work, and mothers spend 2.1 times as much as fathers on the essential and unpaid work of taking care of home and family. If I were looking at this and not wanting to be precise and wanting something to go viral, it'd be like, okay, if you're a woman, you're spending twice as much time on household chores. Could you pick it apart based on who's included in the American Time Use Survey and things like that? Like, sure, but I would feel much more comfortable with that stat from the Gender Equity Policy Institute going viral compared to the 7-hour stat, which is outdated and mysterious. We don't really know where it comes from. So why does the influencer go with the 7 hours, right? Like I kind of wonder like how they even came across it in the first place when there is actually more up-to-date data on the same topic. The 2024 report is the most recent, but there are others just to show that like this type of analysis is not uncommon. In 2013, Pew Research, another more reputable source, looked at the American time use data from 2003 to 2011, and they found the same general trend. Men are working more paid hours, women are doing more housework and childcare. There was a 2022 meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is like a study of other studies. It found this was true globally. So around the world, women are spending more hours on unpaid labor. Interesting fact about the meta-analysis, the media picked up that study and ran headlines claiming women spend about double the amount of time on chores that men do. Study. And then in the article, they say they found women in the US spend about 4.5 hours per day caring for their families and homes, while men spend about 2.8 hours a day on the same or similar tasks. Take a wild guess what two numbers are not even in that meta analysis. They always say, like, the great thing about media is that they fact check. And, like, I'm just, like, my jaw is always on the floor. Like, do they fact check? Who's fact checking this? Most importantly, to cite that particular meta analysis in an article about comparing men and women's time spent on chores doesn't make sense because the meta analysis is actually not about that. The purpose of the meta analysis was to look at the relationship between unpaid labor and mental health. Totally different purpose, but why matters. Important context. So, what is my point here? In short, if husbands truly create an extra 7 hours of housework, that seems like a very knowable stat. There is data in this area, someone could figure it out, but it doesn't appear that anyone has. So, why are we sharing it? This is not just about one viral stat. This is about the fact that research impacts every single part of our lives, whether you realize it or not. It is the backbone of public policy, of healthcare decisions, of economic planning, of disaster response, of education, even marketing and product development. If you have been following the news, you know that there have been massive budget cuts to research funding. As I have watched countless researchers be laid off, countless research firms cut their budget, cut their workforce over the past 4 weeks, I have just been like biting my nails with anxiety because these cuts matter more than you could possibly conceive. Like, it is not just an issue for like academics sitting in the university. Yes, it is sad that people are losing jobs. Like, it's not just about people losing jobs, it is about us losing knowledge. When research funding gets slashed, when we push researchers out, we are not just losing numbers on a spreadsheet, we are losing our ability to fact check power. We are losing our ability to make informed decisions about our lives, about our families, about our communities, about our policies, about our future. When we don't have reliable, well funded research, that like void of information does not stay empty. It gets filled by misinformation, by cherry picked data, and by political spin. Yes, I'm on my soapbox. I know research can seem like this like stuffy thing in academia and universities. It's like so inaccessible and not important, but I really urge you to think about research as our way of understanding and making sense of the world around us, our way of like learning and growing and making things better and making better decisions. I always say like research is a superpower and it can be used as an incredible tool for good, but only if it's done well, only if it's transparent, only if it's accessible, only if it's up to date. If your eyes and ears aren't already open, open them up to what's going on. I sound like such a like prepper doomsdayer, but data disappearing makes me very nervous about what narratives are going to get pushed and our inability to push back on them. And funding for research makes me very nervous because research is what allows us to figure out patterns and describe what is true. So, how do you push back against things you may not need or things that are not true if you don't have access to the research to support it? I kind of think about it as like research gives you power to question things because you have access to data and information. Like access to sources of truth is the hope, right? Like that's what good research does is it gives you a highly contextualized piece of truth that you can use to better understand the world and make decisions. So that if someone tells you something that doesn't feel right to you can go and you can look at data and you can look at studies and you can understand and be like, does this apply to me? Is this a truth for me? I care about fact checking viral things on the internet because when a stat goes viral, people can use it to shape their worldview. They can use it to shape decisions that they're making. And if it is based on bad data or it is taken out of context, now they're making a bad decision. Now their whole perspective of the world is changing based on something that's not true. The harder it is to fund research, the harder it is going to be to find reliable, unfiltered information. So, what's the takeaway? Become a critical consumer of research because that skill too is only going to become increasingly more valuable as we lose access to real data. If we don't fight for research now, we are going to wake up one day too late and realize we don't know anything about what's true anymore. And influencers, if you're going to say you read a study, damn well make sure you've actually read it. This has been Is This Legit with me, Dr. Kirsten Lee Hill. Remember, question everything, especially the science that makes it to your screens.